We're here today with Professor Joshua Tucker. He is a professor of politics at New York University and co-director of the Center for Social Media and Politics, also at NYU. Welcome, Professor Tucker.
Thanks, it's a pleasure to be here.
Pleasure is mine. So I'd like to know what your thoughts were on the conference on fake news and the elections at 2018 in Brazil. What were the main insights that you found interesting, and how did you deal with that sort of legal discussion, even though you're a political scientist?
So what I found fascinating about the conference was my ability to be here for a day and learn so much about how Brazil is trying to address the question of dealing with fake news and how Brazil is using its legal system in doing so. Mm-hmm. It's interesting because when you're in the United States, the home of Facebook, the home of Google, mm-hmm. you can get very myopic, and people can get very myopic about thinking about what's happening in terms of the United States being the be-all, end-all of the impact of these platforms on what's going on in the political arena. But of course, that's not the case. What sort of makes Facebook so unique, I mean, among other things, is that it's in just about every country in the world, and that you've got a couple billion people around the world who are using this platform. Same thing for Google and YouTube and some of these other platforms that are out there like that. And so it was fascinating for me to get to take a day out of my time and listen to how this is being played out in Brazil. And I think that to the best of my knowledge, this was the first time I had ever had an opportunity to hear an in-depth discussion around a system that was set up to use the judiciary to adjudicate questions of whether or not there was fake news in an election campaign. And the Brazilian system is fascinating. Whether it makes a lot of sense or whether it works is I'm looking forward to learning about from your research. But the very fact that this exists is quite interesting. And the very fact that it gives a redress to candidates is interesting. You know, we have already watched in the run-up to the 2020 presidential election in the United States, candidates struggling with how to deal with when they think they're being attacked online. Right, they can go to the newspaper, they can call up the platforms, but they don't have this mechanism that we have in Brazil. So for me, that was very illuminating listening to. So some of it was legalese, and some of it was, less interesting to me than the overall general concept of it. But it was fascinating to get a window into from so many experts and so many people who are thinking about this, both from the civil society side and from the legal side. I'll tell you the other thing that was super interesting to me that if you asked what was the biggest insight I took away from this, this may be a gross generalization, but in the US, my sense is that when I come in contact with civil society actors, they want the platforms to do more in terms of content regulation, and they want the state to do more to hold the platforms accountable for doing more in terms of content regulation. Now, the US is a pretty odd case because of the First Amendment and because a lot of things get circumscribed in terms of freedom of speech, and it's part of our Constitution. But nevertheless, that's what I'm sort of used to in dealing with people from civil society. And in general, in the US, my position is I find myself pushing back on that, because as someone who comes from studying comparative politics, my thought is often, well, if you empower the state to force the platforms to do X, Y, and Z, right, how is this going to play out in authoritarian regimes as well, right? Where we think of social media as this tool that's able to give, pro-democracy activists who are shut out of mainstream media in authoritarian countries a voice and a way to get organized. Remember, social media was originally called liberation technology. But at Brazil, what was interesting, both from the presentations, but also in talking with some of the panelists over lunch and during the breaks, is that it seemed like in Brazil, civil society is pushing back against the efforts of the state to get involved in content moderation. And that's a really interesting distinction. So here you have this country that has set up this mechanism to basically compel the platforms to pull information off of the internet during the election campaign, and you have civil society saying, wait a second, is that power being used correctly? Is that power being used wisely? And whereas in the United States, I feel like civil society actors most of the time are saying, well, why doesn't the state just do something about this, right? Like, why don't the platforms get involved and do more about content moderation? So it's interesting to see, and I will take that back to the US with me, to discussions that I have with civil society actors, how quickly this gets flipped, right? Where all of a sudden Brazilian civil society actors, I think, are so interested in the data that you collected because they want to see, what did the courts do with this power that they took, got granted to them, established, who knows exactly where the power came from. But I think the civil society activists are interested to see what you do because of the question of whether this power is being abused or it's being enforced in a haphazard way or potentially even in a corrupt way. And so that's different. right? That's different from what I tend to think of when I encounter civil society activists talking about content moderation and fake news in the US.
And in terms of the data that we're publishing, we're collecting data on the plaintiffs and the defendants, we're collecting data on the URLs, we're collecting metadata on these court cases. What did you find most interesting, and what are you looking forward to explore in terms of the possibilities of this data in constructing hypotheses and testing things out and seeing how this disinformation campaign worked out in the elections?
Yeah, so this is a fascinating data set, and I think it's amazing that you guys have gone through all the steps you have to collect this. And it's interesting because my guess is you sort of feel like you stumbled upon this thing, you saw you could scrape this stuff online, you start getting a team together, you got some people to fund it. But I think that's the way a lot of stuff happens in the study of social media and politics, because unlike mainstream political science, where it's like you and I could sit down and write 15 questions that people were trying to answer 20 years ago, they're trying to answer now, and they're probably going to be answering in 20 years. It's with this new sort of world of digital technology and politics, things are changing so quickly that we don't even know what the next question is going to be. And a lot of these advances are things that people sort of realize, hey, I have access to this data. There's a really important question I can answer with this data that no one's even asked before, right? So one of the papers that I presented during my keynote address at the conference was based on who had shared fake news on Facebook in the United States during the 2016 election campaign. Much like you guys have stumbled upon the fact that these court cases are out there, we realized after the election, right, that now all of a sudden people had posted lists of these fake news domains that were sharing fake news during the 2016 election. And we happened to have a survey where 40% of the people in the survey had shared their Facebook posts with us. So we could actually go and test who shared fake news on Facebook. We could get demographic correlates of this, right? And I think so it's an exciting kind of time, and it needs people doing the kind of innovative work that you and your team are doing of thinking like, what are the questions we really want to answer, and how might we be able to answer this? And I found it incredibly innovative that you were able to build this data set off of something that's kind of prevalent around the world, right? Which is court cases being posted online, the sort of whole e-government movement to make government more transparent. You and your team found a really excellent way to go into the data, very creatively get down from 90,000 potentially cases to this close to 1,500 or 1,600 cases that you think are relevant to this question of fake news and whether fake news needs to be taken down off the internet. And I think the data is incredibly rich because, as you said, there are many different vantage points with which you can approach it. You can get judge level data out of this, you can get regional level data out of this, you can get URL level data out of it, which means you can get platform level data out of it. You asked what I was most interested in. It's incredibly preliminary, but you had this one slide that you showed, and admittedly it was based on very few cases because you had just hand-coded up a random sample, but that YouTube videos were being taken, requests to take down YouTube content was being taken down at a much higher rate than other content, which from my perspective immediately jumped to, well, is this a platform affordance? Is this something about video, right? Are judges more willing to order the takedown of video than they are of text? Which I think is a really important question that you guys should begin exploring, and we've been talking about this afternoon, ways that you could go about doing that. Because of course, while YouTube is all video, Facebook, some of it's video, Instagram, some of it's video, and even news sites, some of the stuff you'll see there is video. So, but I think at the end of the day, what's so incredibly exciting about this is that we have lots and lots of speculation the world over about what would happen if only the state got involved and started regulating content and was pulling down fake news during elections, right? There are a lot of people in the United States who think, man, wouldn't it have been great if we could have compelled the platforms to take these, the Pope endorsing Donald Trump off of Facebook during the course of the 2016 elections. We're continuing to relitigate these debates over and over again as we head into the 2020 elections in the United States and in countries around the world that are having elections. But you guys now are actually going to have a data set where you're going to have hard data when you finally get this thing coded up, when you get the final variable, which is whether or not the content was removed or the content is still up online. Once that's coded up, we'll be able to test hypotheses about this. You will have actual hard data about what content was removed and what content was not removed. And we can begin to see, well, what happens when you give judges the power to do this, right? Do they take down content of X type? Do they take the right kind of content down? Defining what the right content is a question mark. Or are they guided by lots of other things like raw political power or partisanship or things like that? So we're going to be able to answer a lot of really fascinating questions with this. But at the end of the day, I think you guys have also put a roadmap forward where other people could try to go figure out ways where there's e-government and where judicial decisions are posted online to try to build comparable data sets in other countries. And I hope very much you guys will eventually make the code that you use to put these things together available, so maybe somebody else in another country, say, you know, Argentina or Bolivia, might be able to replicate your analysis much faster because you guys put in all the hard work of figuring out how to build this thing in the first place. But I think it's going to be a really nice contribution to this debate about content moderation and about whether or not, you know, what are the consequences of having the state pull down data. And I think there are a lot of us out there right now who are really trying to get a handle on this question of what does it mean to identify fake news?